The logbook was open to a page dated March 1981, and the line that stopped her read, "This place has a way of keeping you, if you let it." She looked up from the page. The lantern threw amber light across the map wall, topo lines, elevation markers, the faint pencil annotations she had been slowly learning to read, and for a moment she forgot the wind entirely. It was still out there. She could hear it working against the concrete, a low and patient pressure, the kind of sound that reminded you the mountain did not notice you at all. But in here, the stove ticked steadily with heat, the wool blanket was tucked around her legs, and the canned goods on the shelf stood in their neat row, like something dependable. She had been inside for 4 days. She was not sure she wanted to leave. That thought arrived quietly, without drama. She held it the way you hold something fragile, testing its weight. Then she set the logbook down on the cot, pulled the blanket closer, and let herself go back to the beginning, back to 4 days earlier, to the moment when the mountain was still just a problem she was trying to cross. She had left the lower trailhead at first light on a Monday, which was a poor decision, though she had not known that yet. The abandoned highway climbed in long switchbacks through ponderosa pine and white fir, its asphalt cracked and heaved by years of frost and neglect. The center line faded to a ghost. She had found the road on a county map at the library in the last town, a small star, and the notation, "Closed seasonal, rock hazard." Closed roads meant no traffic meant no trouble. She had been making that calculation for 2 years. Her backpack rode the way it always did, the frame slightly bent from a fall the previous spring, the left shoulder strap repaired with electrical tape that had started to peel. Inside, the sleeping bag, a change of clothes, a box of crackers mostly gone, the pocket knife, the flashlight running on batteries she could not afford to replace, and $11 and some change, folded into the front pocket. She had been walking since August. Before that, a farm labor camp in Idaho. Before that, an orchard in Oregon. Before that, a lot of highway that all looked the same after a while. The clouds came in around noon, low and purposeful. By 2 o'clock, the first flakes were falling. By 3, the world had contracted to a corridor of white, between tree lines she could barely see. She kept walking. That was the thing you learned early. You kept walking until you couldn't. And then you found something. The avalanche wall appeared out of the white, like a cliff face, gray and enormous, and running uphill along the road, for as far as she could see in the failing light. She nearly walked past the door. She nearly walked past the door. The wind had been building for the last hour, not gusting but pressing, a steady lateral force that leaned against her left side and made every step feel negotiated rather than taken. The temperature had dropped fast, the kind of drop that happens without announcement, that you notice only when you realize your fingers stopped feeling the strap of the backpack sometime in the last 20 minutes. She had her hood up, she had her head down. She was doing the calculation that you learn to do when the situation narrows. Distance to the next anything, speed of the storm, what she was carrying, what that was worth in hours. The calculation was not coming out well. The flashlight was dim, the batteries nearly spent, throwing a yellowed cone that showed her maybe 8 feet of road surface and little else. She had been running it in short intervals. Click on, look, click off, walk, trying to preserve whatever was left in those batteries, because once they were gone, there was no replacing them tonight. The snow was falling in the kind of earnest, wind-blown sheets that blur the line between sky and ground. The tree lines had gone invisible. There was the road under her boots, and there was the concrete wall to her right, and there was everything else, which was white. She clicked the flashlight on. The pine branch moved. It was a small thing, the wind catching a low branch that had grown out from between a seam in the concrete, bending it sideways and back, and she would have walked past it, except that when the branch swung back, It left something briefly exposed in the flashlight beam, a shape that concrete did not make on its own, a recessed vertical shadow, a right angle, the edge of something set into the wall rather than part of it. She stopped. She stood in the blowing snow for a moment that felt longer than it was, the flashlight yellowing out against the concrete. Then she stepped off the road surface and moved toward the wall. The pine branch had grown almost flush against the face, and a curtain of ice had formed along the top of the frame, not thick, but layered. The accumulation of many freeze-thaw cycles sealed into a kind of fringe that hung down and obscured everything below it. She pushed the branch aside with her forearm. She knocked the ice fringe with the back of her hand, and pieces of it fell and shattered on the ground at her feet. There it was, a door, gray on gray, the same concrete gray paint as the wall itself, set back perhaps 2 inches into the frame, and at the center of it, at about waist height, a recessed iron pull handle, black with rust, small enough to miss entirely if the branch had not moved at exactly that second. She stood there breathing. The wind hit the wall above her and skated off into the dark. She reached out and took hold of the handle. The handle did not move at first. It was frozen into the recess, the iron fused to the surrounding metal plate by years of melt and refreeze. And when she pulled, nothing gave. She adjusted her grip, wrapped both hands around the bar, and pulled again with her weight behind it. Something cracked. Not the door, but the ice seal around the frame, a sound like a knuckle popping, and the handle swung outward a 1/4 inch and stopped. She worked it back and forth, small arcs, patient, feeling the resistance loosen incrementally. The cold had made the iron slick, and her fingers were going numb, but she kept working the motion until the handle swung freely in its bracket. Then she set her shoulder against the door, braced her feet in the snow, and pushed. The door ground open against a compacted drift that had built against the interior base of the frame. It moved 3 inches, 6. She drove her shoulder harder and felt the drift crumble and pack sideways, and the door swung inward with a sound like tearing cloth, a long, low scrape of steel against concrete, and a breath of air came out. It did not smell of rot. It smelled of cold stone and something faintly mineral, like a well. She stepped inside. The wind stopped. That was the first thing. The roaring that had been in her ears for the past several hours simply ended, cut off, the moment she cleared the frame, replaced by a pressureless quiet that felt almost physical. The cold was still there. The same temperature, she guessed, or close to it. But cold without wind is a different kind of cold entirely. She stood in the dark and breathed. Then she raised the flashlight. The beam was weak, the batteries nearly spent, and it threw a yellow cone that only reached so far. She swept it left, then right, then straight ahead. The corridor was cut into solid rock, the ceiling maybe 7 feet up, the walls rough and narrow, the floor poured concrete, like the road outside. It ran back into the mountain further than her light could reach. She moved the beam slowly, and the shapes in it resolved one by one. A cot, a folded wool blanket, a shelf of cans along the left wall, their labels turned forward. Neat. 3 lanterns hung from a crossbar of steel pipe bolted to the ceiling. A small iron stove against the right wall, a stovepipe disappearing into the rock above it. A wooden crate beside the cot with something stacked on top of it she could not yet identify. Maps, she saw that last, and she stopped moving the beam. Maps pinned across the far end of the corridor, covering the back wall almost completely. Topographic lines dense and careful, the paper yellowed at the edges but intact. She stood and looked at it for a long moment. The flashlight flickered once. This was not a storage room. She did not let herself feel it yet. Feeling it could wait. What could not wait was the cold. The stove was small, cast iron, the kind that highway crews used in field shacks. A door no bigger than a paperback book, and a damper handle worn smooth from years of turning. She crouched in front of it and opened the door. The firebox was clean. Someone had swept it out before they left, a decade ago or more, and it had stayed that way in the sealed dark. She found the wood stacked just inside the corridor door, split and dry, maybe 2 feet of cord piled against the wall. She had not seen it when she entered. She built a fire the way she had learned in her second winter out, kindling first, small splits angled to let air move, 1 match and patience rather than 3 matches and hope. The smoke rose into the stovepipe without hesitation and kept going. The draw was clean. Heat began to come almost immediately from the iron, a faint ticking as the metal expanded, and then something she had not felt in weeks. Warmth that was not just the memory of warmth. She let the fire settle and went to the hand pump. It was bolted to a low wooden bench at the back left of the corridor, below the maps, a simple iron pump painted green so long ago the paint had mostly gone. She worked the handle with both hands, slow and even. For the first 20 strokes, nothing came except air and a hollow clanking that sounded like she was pulling something up from the center of the earth. Then a sound changed in the pipe. Something shifted below, and on the 32nd stroke, water came. It ran brown for 5 seconds, then gray, then clear. She cupped her hand and tasted it. Cold, clean, faintly mineral. She pumped until she had filled the small tin basin she found hanging from a nail beside the bench, and she washed her hands and face and drank from her cupped palms until the ache in her throat was gone. Then she inventoried the shelves. The canned goods ran the full length of the left wall on 2 fixed boards. She went through them methodically, pulling each can forward, reading the label, setting it back. Pork and beans, corn, tomatoes, 4 cans, peaches, condensed milk 2, green beans, beef stew, 3 cans, dented on one side but intact. She counted as she went, and wrote nothing down, because she had nothing to write with, but she had always kept numbers in her head out of necessity. 18 cans total. Enough. Outside, she could hear the wind had changed pitch. Higher now, more constant, the kind of sound that meant the storm had committed itself. She did not go to check. She already knew. She stood in the center of the corridor, with the stove clicking warmth into the close air, and made the decision plainly, without ceremony. She was staying. The second morning she knew before she tried the door. The quality of silence had changed. Thicker, muffled at the edges. The way sound behaves when it has been absorbed, rather than simply absent. She pressed her palm flat against the steel and felt nothing. No vibration. No wind finding the seam. She braced and pulled the handle. The door moved an inch, maybe less, and stopped. The resistance wasn't mechanical. It was mass. She released the handle and stood a moment in the stove-warmed dark, and what she felt was not fear, but something closer to the recognition of a fact. She was inside. Outside was somewhere else now. She spent the first hour of containment in useful motion. She restacked the canned goods by caloric weight. Proteins first, carbohydrates second, fruit last. She checked the stove's damper and adjusted the draw. She found a stub of pencil in a coffee tin beside the maps and used the back of a torn label to begin a list. What she had, what she needed, what could wait. The act of writing it down, even on paper that small, made the inventory real in a different way than memorizing it had. Then she had done what could reasonably be done, and the corridor was quiet around her, and she sat on the cot with a lantern turned low and pulled the nearest logbook from the stack. The handwriting was small and consistent, leaning slightly right. The letters formed with the kind of discipline that came from filling out official forms for many years. The earliest entries were road records, snowpack measurements, culvert conditions, milepost notations, dates, professional observations. She read them without impatience, understanding that this was where the voice began. before it changed into something else. It changed by the third page. Stayed an extra hour after the shift. The wind out of the northeast keeps the near slope almost clear, maybe 12 inches settled where the rest of the road holds 3 feet. Worth watching. And a few entries later, the room is holding temperature better than I expected. The rock keeps it. I think the rock has been keeping heat for 40 years, and nobody thought to use it. She read slowly, the lantern making a small, warm radius around the cot. Outside, the storm pressed against the mountain in long, even waves she could hear only faintly, as if it were happening in another country. Inside, there was the tick of the stove, the faint mineral smell of the spring, the smell of old paper and kerosene, and the handwriting of a man who had found this place and understood, the same way she had, what it could be. He wrote about the stove installation across 4 separate entries, the difficulty of the flue, a mistake with the mortar that had to be corrected twice, his satisfaction when the draft finally drew clean. He wrote about it plainly, without boasting, the way a person recounts work that cost them something real. She turned the page. She slept well on the second night, which surprised her. The cot was narrow and the blanket smelled of cedar and thyme, but the stove held its heat through the dark hours, and she woke only once, briefly, to the sound of wind shifting direction against the wall. She lay still and listened to it settle, then slept again. By the third morning, the storm had not broken. She could hear it in the way the silence beyond the door had a particular weight to it. Not quiet so much as muffled, the mountain wrapped in something dense. She checked the stove, fed it 2 small pieces of wood from the diminishing stack near the door, and stood at the maps. She had looked at them the first day, but only broadly, the way you look at anything when you are still cold and still frightened. Now, she looked properly. There were 6 maps total, pinned in overlapping sequence along the wall. 3 were standard topographic quadrangles, the kind the Forest Service printed by the thousand. 2 were hand-annotated road condition surveys, the paper heavier, the grid lines in pale blue. The last was something he had drawn himself, or begun to draw, then supplemented with clippings from the others, taped and trimmed to fill in what his own hand hadn't managed. This one she studied longest. His notations were small and economical, written in the same compressed handwriting as the journals. She had already learned to read his shorthand from the logbooks, a double dash for wind exposure, a small triangle for rockfall debris, a circle with a line through it for road closure. These she recognized. But on the hand-drawn map, running upslope from a point approximately a quarter-mile east of the shelter door, there was a faint penciled line she had not noticed before. It climbed the contour in a series of short diagonal strokes, a switchback trail, she realized, or something that functioned like one, and terminated at a flat area marked with a small symbol she did know, the double-slash triangle, his mark for firewood. A reliable collection point, she guessed, sheltered enough to keep deadfall dry. Beside it, slightly offset, was a second symbol she had not seen anywhere else in his notation system. A small square with a circle centered inside it. No label, no explanation in any of the journals she had read so far. She pulled the last logbook from the shelf and opened it to its final blank page. There were several, the journal never finished. She set it on the shelf beside the hand-drawn map and began to copy the relevant section. She worked slowly, measuring proportions with her thumb, getting the contour intervals as accurate as she could manage freehand. The trail, the firewood mark, the unexplained symbol, the scale notation she transposed from the printed quadrangle. When she finished, she studied her copy against the original for a long moment, then wrote a single question at the bottom of the page. What is the square? She would find out. She slept twice more before the storm broke. She knew it was breaking before she opened her eyes, not from any sound, but from the absence of one. The wind had been a constant presence for 4 days, a low-frequency pressure against the outer wall that she had stopped consciously hearing, but had never stopped feeling. When it ceased, the silence woke her as surely as a sound would have. She lay still for a moment. The stove had burned low. The nearest lantern had gone out sometime in the night, and the corridor held only the dim warmth of the remaining flame and the faint gray seam of light along the bottom edge of the steel door. Gray light, not dark. She sat up. She built the fire back first, small, deliberate, then pulled on every layer she owned before she touched the door. The iron handle was cold enough to sting through her gloves. She set her shoulder against the steel, pushed, and felt resistance. Not the resistance of the latch, but weight. She pushed harder, leaning into it, and the door gave suddenly, swinging outward, and a foot-thick slab of compressed snow calved away from the frame and fell across her boots. She dug for 20 minutes with the flat of her arm and the folded cardboard she'd kept back from the supply shelf. When the arc was wide enough, she stepped through. The world was white and utterly without shadow. Overcast sky, snowpack 4 feet deep against the wall, the pine boughs bent nearly double under their loads. No wind, no sound, except the occasional soft collapse of snow from an upper branch. She stood in it, her eyes adjusted slowly. The highway, what had been the highway, was an unmarked plain of white. The tree line beyond it was dark and still. Above her, the slope of the avalanche wall rose clean and gray against the pale sky, and the road cut stretched away in both directions until it disappeared into the trees. She did not move for a long time. She had read the final logbook entry the previous evening, near the end of the 3rd day, when she had finally worked her way through to the last pages. The entry was dated October 1985. The handwriting was the same careful print she'd come to recognize, slightly more compressed than his earlier entries, as if he were conserving space without entirely meaning to. He had written about the quality of the light that afternoon, the temperature, the state of the snowpack on the upper slope. And then, mid-sentence, the pen had stopped. The sentence was about return, about next time. The words simply ended, not crossed out, not completed, just left. She had read it 3 times. Now she looked at the wall. The door was propped open behind her, and faint warmth moved through the gap into the cold air. She did not name the decision she made, standing there in the snow. She just made it. Then she turned back to go inside and get to work. She started with the cans. There were 23 of them. She counted twice, then arranged them on the shelf in order of protein content, making rough estimates from the labels. Beans first, then fish, then vegetables, then broth. She pulled out a logbook and found a blank back page and wrote down what she had, what she estimated she needed per day, and how many days that gave her. The math came out to 19 days if she was careful. She decided to be careful. The stove required attention twice daily. She had figured out its rhythm by the 2nd day of the storm, and now she maintained it, without thinking about it much, the way you maintain breathing. A small load in the morning to drive the cold out of the stone. A larger load in the evening. She let it die down overnight and relied on the blanket and the sleeping bag layered together. The cold came through the rock by 3 in the morning regardless, but it was manageable cold, the kind that sharpened rather than defeated. The deadfall was the harder problem. The slope above the road had timber. She could see the tree line clearly on the days the sky was open, but getting there required climbing over the concrete berm at the uphill side of the road, and the snow on the slope was uneven and concealed what was underneath. She went slowly. The first time she brought back 3 armloads and considered it a success. The second time she found a natural shelf in the slope where fallen timber had collected against a granite outcropping, which was better than luck. It was a feature of the terrain she could return to. She mapped what she could reach. The highway ran roughly northeast to southwest, and the avalanche wall sat on the northeast-facing side. In the first clear stretch after the storm broke, She walked southwest along the road for perhaps a mile, noting where frost heave had buckled the asphalt and where rockfall from the upper slope had blocked the shoulder. The road was not impassable on foot, but it would stop a vehicle. She noted this. On the second trip she went northeast instead, longer and colder, into the shadow of the ridge that blocked the morning sun until well after 10 o'clock. She almost missed it. It was the snow that had preserved it, actually, built up against a signpost that had tilted maybe 30 degrees off vertical and then frozen in place. She scraped the ice from the face of the sign with her knife handle. The lettering came clear in sections: a county route number, a district designation, and below that, small and bureaucratic, and faded to near illegibility, the name of the road district office. She stood in the cold reading it, until she had it committed to memory. She did not have paper with her. She said the words aloud once, quietly, into the empty road. Then she turned and walked back toward the wall. She gave herself 3 days to prepare. The first day she reorganized the logbooks, pulling the builder's earliest volumes and setting them aside in order. She selected 4, the ones that documented the shelter's construction most clearly, the ones where his handwriting was steadiest and his notes most methodical. She read them through again, with the eye of someone who would need to explain them to a stranger, in a fluorescent-lit office. She thought about what questions a clerk might ask, and what answers the pages already contained. The second day she wrote out her own condition report in full, clean draft. She had been keeping rough notes on loose paper torn from the back of a blank maintenance log, and now she transferred everything into a single document, dated, organized by direction of survey, precise about location. Frost heave at approximately 0.3 miles southwest, extending roughly 40 feet along the shoulder. Rockfall debris on the north lane at approximately 0.9 miles. Largest piece estimated 200 pounds. The tilted route marker at 1.2 miles northeast. She did not editorialize. She wrote the way the builder had written. Flat, factual, useful. The third day she walked the road one more time in both directions and added 2 observations she had missed. On the fourth morning, she locked the steel door behind her and started down the mountain. 18 miles takes time at altitude in late winter. She walked steadily and did not hurry. The road descended through switchbacks where the snowpack was still knee-deep in the shaded sections, and she moved through these carefully, reading the surface before each step. By early afternoon, the elevation had dropped enough that the snow thinned to a hard crust, and then to gravel and frozen mud. The trees changed character, less spruce, more pine, then scrub oak appearing at the lower bends. The air tasted different. The town was small. She found the road district office in a beige cinder-block building beside the county maintenance yard. A flag, a truck with the county seal on the door. Inside, a front desk, a filing cabinet, a space heater running in the corner. The clerk was a middle-aged man who looked up from paperwork with an expression that was not unwelcoming, but was not expecting her either. She set the logbooks on the counter, 4 of them, stacked squarely, and then placed her own written report on top. She told him what she had found. She told him when she had found it. She told him what condition the shelter was in, and what condition the road was in, and that she had been walking the survey corridor for 2 weeks and writing down what she observed. She asked him what the district's current policy was regarding the shelter and the closed highway section. He looked at the stack on his counter for a long moment. He said he would have to make some calls. He said she should come back in a week. She thanked him and walked back out into the thin winter light. The feed and supply store was 2 blocks from the road district office, set back from the street behind a gravel lot. The sign above the door had been repainted at least twice, the original letters ghosting through the newer ones. Inside, metal shelving, the smell of seed and oil and burlap, a wood stove in the back corner that had clearly been burning all winter. The owner was behind the counter inventorying a box of hinges, setting them out in rows with methodical patience. He was past 70, she guessed. Big hands, a face organized by decades of weather. She bought a box of wooden matches and a small tin of stove lubricant, and while he was making change, she asked, carefully, whether he knew anything about the old highway maintenance crew that had worked the mountain road. He stopped counting coins and looked at her more carefully than he had before. He said he knew the road, yes. He said the district had stopped maintaining the upper section sometime around 88 or 89, after the third bad slide season. He said there had been one man who worked that stretch for a very long time, longer than most would have. Mostly solitary work. The man used to come down for supplies once every few weeks through the season, sometimes less in winter. He was not unfriendly, but he was not a talker either. He knew the mountain in the specific way that people know things they have spent years paying attention to. She asked when he had stopped coming in. The owner thought about it. He said the man retired in 83. He said after that, he came down a few more times. For supplies mostly. Not much different from before. Except there was no county truck anymore. Just his own vehicle. Then he stopped coming entirely. There had been some talk that the shelter up there had been sealed off when they closed the road. People mostly assumed the whole stretch had been left alone. She asked if anyone had gone looking. He said not that he knew of. He said people up here had a different relationship with the mountain than people elsewhere might. You didn't go looking unless you had reason. She thanked him and picked up her matches and her tin of lubricant. He asked, without pressure, whether she had found something up there. She said she had found the shelter. She said it was intact. She said someone had taken very good care of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that sounded about right for that man. He said some people leave things the way they want to find them, even when they know they won't be back. She walked out into the cold. The sky was pale and still, the mountains visible above the tree line at the edge of town. She stood for a moment in the gravel lot with the matches in her coat pocket, listening to nothing in particular. The journals had told her the shape of his days. Now she had the shape of his name in the world, not the name itself, but the space it occupied. That was enough. The snow left the highway in pieces. First the south-facing stretches, then the flat apron in front of the wall, then at last the narrow track leading up through the pines toward the plateau. She had watched it go day by day, the way a person watches something they have been waiting for, without admitting they were waiting. The morning she chose was the first morning that felt like a different season, rather than a pause in the same one. The air still had cold in it, but the cold had lost its authority. She laced her boots, filled her water bottle from the pump, and took the topographic map from the wall, the one with the penciled trail marked in thin, careful strokes, the kind of marks a person makes when they expect to follow the line themselves many more times. The trail climbed steeply for the first quarter mile, switching back twice through dense spruce before opening onto a long, rocky spine with a view down into the valley. She stopped there long enough to orient herself against the map. The penciled line continued northwest along the spine, then dropped slightly toward a depression she could not yet see. She found the hollow where the map said it would be. It was ringed on three sides by a dense crescent of fir trees, old growth, the kind that had been standing long enough to bend the wind around them. Inside the crescent, the air was noticeably quieter. She stood at the edge and understood at once why he had chosen it. The trees did the work a wall would do, without requiring anything of anyone. The raised beds were there, 4 of them, arranged in a simple grid, their log frames grayed and soft at the corners, but still holding their angles. Dead vegetation matted over the surface, blackened stems, collapsed stalks, the remnants of several seasons of growth, left to return slowly to the soil. She crouched at the nearest bed and pushed the debris aside with her hand. Beneath it, the soil was dark and loose, the kind of dark that comes from years of amendment. Compost worked in patiently, season after season. She pressed 2 fingers into the second knuckle without effort. She stood up and looked at the map again. The small square. The circle. She had stared at those marks all winter, turning over possibilities. And here they were, a bed frame and a windbreak. The simplest explanation, drawn by a man who had no need to make anything more complicated than it was. She did not go back for tools. She used a stout stick from the tree line and began turning the first bed that same afternoon, working the dead matter under, exposing the soil to the light. It was slow work. Her shoulders ached before she finished half of it. She kept going until the light began to flatten and the hollow grew cool again. The turned earth smelled like rain and thyme, and something she could not name but recognized. The response came on a Tuesday in the second week of May, folded inside a plain envelope that the supply store owner set on the counter, without ceremony, the way he did most things. She read it twice, standing at the counter, then folded it back along its original creases and tucked it into her jacket pocket. He watched her without appearing to watch her. "Good news, I take it." "Reasonable news," she said. He nodded once and went back to whatever he had been doing. She walked out into the morning. The language was careful, the way official language always is, hedged and conditional, and signed by someone whose title occupied more space than their name. Seasonal occupancy, annual review, trail condition reports submitted to the district office by the 1st of each month, October through April. Access maintained, no permanent alteration to infrastructure. She had read enough of the builder's logbooks to know that he had done exactly this work, in exactly this way, for 20 years, and no one had thought to write it down as an arrangement until she asked them to. She drove the 18 miles back up the mountain with the windows down. The air at the lower elevations already smelled like warming pine and wet ground. Higher up it still carried cold, but a different cold than winter, thinner, cleaner. The kind that reminds you that the altitude is permanent and the season is not. She carried the envelope inside without opening it again. She already knew what it said. What she did instead, she took the hand-drawn map she had made over the winter, the corridor, the plateau, the hollow, the spring, the tree line marked for firewood, the trail she had walked a dozen times until she knew every turning, and she pinned it on the wall beside the builder's. Hers was less precise in some ways, more precise in others. It showed things that had not existed when he worked here. The repaired bed frames, the new-cut trail markers she had notched into a pine at the plateau's edge, the measured distance from the door to the spring head. She opened the last logbook to the final page she had not yet touched and wrote the date. Below it she wrote a single line about road conditions, dry and factual, the way his entries always were. Then below that, below his initials at the bottom of the final entry from October 1985, she wrote her own name. Not initials, her name. She closed the logbook and set it back on the shelf. Outside, the wind moved through the tree line with a sound like distant water, and the light through the open door fell long and pale across the stone floor. The stove held the last of the morning's warmth. The lanterns were full. The hand pump drew clean and cold when she worked it, the way it always had. She did not pack her bag that night, or the night after that,